At 38, Daniel Harper had already buried every version of the future he once believed in. His construction company had collapsed under a mountain of debt. The bank had taken his home. His marriage had quietly ended months before the bankruptcy papers were even signed. On the morning he walked out of the courthouse, everything he owned fit inside the back of an aging pickup truck, and after paying his final legal fees, exactly $30,000 remained in his account. Most people would have guarded that money with their lives. Daniel did the opposite. He drove straight to a county tax auction and spent every last dollar on a forgotten Victorian mansion that everyone else refused to touch. The roof sagged. The windows were boarded shut. Rain leaked through cracked ceilings. Locals whispered that anyone foolish enough to buy the place would lose far more than money. When the auctioneer announced, $30,000, sold, a few people actually laughed. One man shook his head and muttered, "That house will bury him faster than bankruptcy ever could." Even Daniel wondered if they were right. For days, he hauled out rotten furniture, broken plaster, and decades of dust, questioning whether he just traded financial ruin for a lifetime of regret. Then, while pulling away a warped wooden bookcase that seemed oddly heavier than it should have been, something unexpected happened. The entire wall shifted. Behind it wasn't another room. It was a sealed stone doorway with an old brass lock that looked as though no one had touched it for generations. When Daniel finally found the matching key hidden inside the house and turned it, he discovered something that would rewrite not only the history of the mansion, but the history of his own family. We'll come back to that moment. But first, let me take you back to the day Daniel Harper lost everything, because that's where this unbelievable story truly begins. Before we start, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. What city or country are you in? And what time is it there right now? Leave a comment below and say hello. I read as many of your comments as I can, and it's always amazing to see people joining from all over the world. If you're listening in the morning, I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. If it's evening where you are, I hope this story helps you relax and unwind. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten places, family secrets, and ordinary people discovering extraordinary legacies, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey. Now, let's go back to the morning Daniel Harper believed his life was over. Daniel Harper stood outside the county courthouse with a cardboard box tucked beneath one arm and the final bankruptcy order folded inside his jacket pocket. The November wind tugged at his coat as lawyers hurried past without noticing him. 3 years earlier, he had walked through these same doors wearing polished boots and carrying blueprints for custom homes his construction company had been hired to build. Back then, people had greeted him with firm handshakes and promises about the future. Now, no one looked twice at the man whose business had collapsed beneath rising material costs, canceled contracts, and loans he could no longer repay. The bank had taken his office months ago. His crew had scattered to find other jobs. His marriage had quietly unraveled under the weight of endless financial stress until the divorce papers arrived almost as routinely as the overdue bills. At 38, Daniel felt older than his father had looked before illness claimed him. Everything he still owned fit inside the bed of his aging pickup truck. He climbed into the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel for several minutes before turning the key. His phone buzzed. It was another collection agency. He silenced it without answering. There was nothing left to discuss. After paying his attorney and settling the final court fees, exactly $30,000 remained in his account. It was every dollar left from selling the last assets the bankruptcy trustee hadn't claimed. Most people would have guarded that money as the beginning of a new life. Daniel wasn't even sure where a new life was supposed to begin. He drove aimlessly through town until a faded sign caught his attention outside the county administration building. Tax foreclosure auction today. He almost kept driving. Instead, he parked and wandered inside, more curious than hopeful. Folding chairs filled the room. Contractors, investors, and retirees flipped through auction catalogs while chatting about rental properties and renovation costs. Daniel accepted a copy from a volunteer and found a seat near the back. Most listings were ordinary houses or empty lots. Then one photograph stopped him. It showed a weathered Victorian mansion standing alone beyond rusted iron gates. Its steep roof sagged. Several windows were boarded, and ivy nearly swallowed the front porch. Even in decay, the house possessed a quiet dignity that made him pause. The description was brief. Harper House, built 1891, vacant. Structural damage, sold as is. Daniel frowned at the family name. Harper wasn't uncommon, yet seeing it printed beneath the photograph stirred a faint curiosity he couldn't explain. The auction began. Properties changed hands quickly. Experienced bidders barely hesitated. Prices climbed, hammers fell. Paperwork changed owners. Finally, the Victorian mansion appeared on the screen. The auctioneer adjusted his glasses. Property 47. Minimum bid, $30,000. Silence answered him. Someone in the front row chuckled. Another man whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Needs twice that just to stop the roof from falling in. A woman flipped past the page in her catalog without another glance. The auctioneer tried again. 30,000. No paddles rose. Daniel studied the faded photograph. Once, someone had loved that house. He noticed stone chimneys, handcrafted trim beneath the roofline, tall windows designed to fill the rooms with light. He had restored enough old buildings to recognize careful workmanship beneath years of neglect. The practical side of his mind listed every reason to walk away. The emotional side kept returning to the Harper name. Before he fully realized what he was doing, Daniel raised his bidder card. 30,000. Heads turned. The auctioneer nodded. 30,000. Any higher bids? None came. A man near the aisle laughed openly. Good luck buying yourself a money pit, another added. Should have burned it down years ago. The auctioneer waited another moment before striking the gavel. Sold. Several people shook their heads as Daniel signed the purchase documents. One older contractor recognized him. Harper, isn't it? I remember your company. Hate to see what happened. Daniel forced a polite smile. Thanks. The man glanced at the paperwork. This place won't save you. Daniel folded the deed into his jacket. Maybe not. The drive to the mansion took nearly 40 minutes through rolling farmland and quiet roads lined with bare trees. Afternoon sunlight faded behind gray clouds by the time iron gates appeared beside the highway. One gate leaned crooked on broken hinges. Weeds covered the long gravel drive leading toward the house. Daniel parked near the entrance and walked the remaining distance, listening only to the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. Up close, the mansion looked even larger than the photograph suggested. Its tower still rose proudly above the surrounding trees despite missing several shingles. Decorative woodwork framed the porch. Though years of rain had stripped away much of the paint, fallen leaves gathered across cracked stone steps. He unlocked the front door with the keys provided at closing. The heavy oak door groaned as it opened inward. Dust floated through narrow beams of fading daylight. The air smelled of old wood, damp plaster, and forgotten years. Furniture lay draped beneath stained sheets. A cracked grandfather clock stood frozen beside the staircase. Daniel walked slowly through the silent entrance hall, mentally noting broken windows, damaged ceilings, and warped floorboards. Then something caught his attention. Along the wall opposite the staircase, the dust ended in long rectangular shapes stretching almost from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of narrow outlines remained perfectly clean against the faded wallpaper, as though enormous bookshelves had once stood there for decades before disappearing. He stepped closer and brushed his fingers across the marks. The pattern was too deliberate to ignore. Why would anyone remove an entire wall of shelves from a house that had otherwise been abandoned? As evening settled outside, Daniel's flashlight swept across the empty outlines once more. Hidden behind a loose strip of cracked wallpaper, something metallic glinted faintly in the beam. He carefully peeled the paper back and uncovered the end of an old brass key embedded deep inside the wall. The brass key resisted at first. Daniel wrapped his fingers around it and carefully worked it free from the crumbling plaster. Dust drifted onto the hardwood floor as the old metal finally came loose. It was heavier than he expected, its bow decorated with a carved pattern of tiny oak leaves worn smooth by time. There was no tag, no inscription, nothing to explain why someone had hidden it inside the wall instead of leaving it in a drawer or hanging it on a hook. He slipped it into his jacket pocket and looked once more at the faded outlines where bookshelves had once stood. Whoever had removed them had done so deliberately. Yet the rest of the house had been left almost untouched, as though time itself had simply walked away. Darkness settled outside, reminding Daniel he had nowhere else to spend the night. The electricity had long been disconnected, so he unpacked a sleeping bag, a flashlight, bottled water, and a small camping stove from his truck. He heated a can of soup while sitting on the front porch, listening to the wind move through the giant oak trees surrounding the property. The mansion creaked occasionally, but the sounds felt more like an old building settling than anything mysterious. Even so, he slept lightly. At sunrise, he walked the perimeter of the house with a notebook, writing down every repair he could identify. Missing shingles, rotten porch columns, broken gutters, several cracked windows. The foundation appeared stronger than he had feared, though years of neglect had taken their toll elsewhere. If he did most of the labor himself and reused salvageable materials, he might keep the project alive. It would be slow, but slow was better than impossible. By late morning, he began clearing debris from the entrance hall. Broken picture frames, loose plaster, damaged furniture, and countless boxes filled with nothing but mildew had to be carried outside. As he worked, he noticed something odd. The mansion's layout seemed unusually balanced. Every doorway on the left side of the hall had a matching doorway on the right. Windows lined up perfectly from room to room, yet when he measured the distance between two interior walls, the numbers refused to match the exterior dimensions of the house. One section should have been nearly 4 feet wider than it actually was. Daniel frowned. Old houses often settled unevenly, but this felt different. During lunch, he tapped gently along one wall with the handle of his hammer. Most sections answered with a solid thud. Then one area produced a distinctly hollow sound. He tested it again several feet away. Solid. Another tap near the center. Hollow. He marked the spot with a piece of blue painter's tape before continuing his work. The mystery could wait until the house was safe enough to explore. Shortly after noon, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted his cleaning. A woman stepped out carrying 2 paper bags. She looked to be in her mid-30s, wearing jeans, a denim jacket, and practical boots dusted with gravel. She smiled politely when Daniel met her on the porch. "You must be the new owner." "I guess that's me." She held up one of the bags. "I'm Emily Carter. I live about half a mile down the road. I figured anyone moving into this place probably hadn't had time to buy groceries." Daniel laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks. "You're right about that." Inside the bag were sandwiches, apples, coffee, and homemade cookies. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "Around here, we usually welcome new neighbors. We just haven't had one at this house in a very long time." She glanced toward the weathered staircase. "People tend to stay away because they think it's haunted?" Emily smiled. "Mostly because they think it's falling apart." Daniel couldn't argue with that. They ate lunch on the porch while she pointed out nearby stores, hardware suppliers, and the quickest route into town. She mentioned that she worked as the librarian at the public library and often drove past the mansion on her way home. "I always wondered what it looked like inside," she admitted. "It's mostly dust," Daniel said, "and repairs. Old houses usually have stories hidden under the dust." Before leaving, Emily handed him a handwritten list of local contractors willing to sell reclaimed lumber cheaply. "He looked like someone trying to stretch every dollar." Daniel smiled. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do." After she drove away, another visitor arrived less than an hour later. An elderly woman with silver hair climbed carefully from an older sedan, leaning lightly on a wooden cane. Despite her age, her sharp blue eyes missed very little. "Daniel Harper?" she asked. "Yes." "Margaret Ellis." She extended her hand. "I spent 35 years teaching local history before retiring." Curiosity finally got the better of me. Daniel invited her onto the porch. She looked around the property with quiet familiarity. "I remember when this place still had flowers in the front garden," she said softly. "That was a long time ago." They spoke for several minutes about the town's past. Margaret seemed pleasantly surprised that Daniel wanted to restore the house instead of demolishing it. Eventually, she asked, "Did the family name strike you as familiar?" "Harper." Daniel nodded. "Only because it's mine." Margaret tilted her head. "You didn't know this mansion belonged to the Harper family?" He stared at her. "No." "Interesting." She seemed genuinely puzzled. "The house was built by Harpers. That's been part of local history for generations, though not many people remember the details anymore." Daniel shook his head slowly. "My father never mentioned anything like this." Margaret looked toward the tower rising above the roofline. "Perhaps he didn't know either." Before leaving, she promised to search through some of her old research notes. "There may still be records worth reading." Her words lingered with Daniel long after her car disappeared. He spent the afternoon cleaning the library-sized room where the missing shelves had once stood. As layers of grime disappeared, intricate carvings became visible along the remaining built-in woodwork framing the walls. At first, they looked decorative, but brushing away more dust revealed repeating symbols carved with remarkable precision. Small oak branches intertwined with open books. The pattern appeared far too intentional to be simple ornament. He traced one carving with his fingertips, before remembering the brass key in his pocket. The old metal felt unexpectedly warm from the day's work. Looking around the quiet hall, his eyes settled on the staircase. Beneath its lowest landing, hidden behind years of dust, he noticed a tiny brass plate almost invisible against the dark wood. At its center was a keyhole, exactly the size of the one he now held in his hand. Daniel knelt slowly, slid the key into the lock, and felt it fit perfectly. He held his breath as he turned the brass key. At first, nothing happened. Then a dull metallic click echoed beneath the staircase, followed by the groan of old gears that had not moved for decades. Daniel instinctively stepped back. A narrow section of the wooden paneling slowly shifted inward before sliding sideways only a few inches. Dust poured from the opening as stale air escaped from somewhere beyond the wall. He aimed his flashlight through the gap. A brick passage disappeared into darkness. For several seconds he simply stood there, listening. The house settled with its familiar creaks, but nothing else disturbed the silence. He widened the opening enough to squeeze through and carefully stepped inside. The passage was just wide enough for one person. Brick walls surrounded him on both sides, and the ceiling was low enough that he had to duck slightly. The air felt cool and surprisingly dry. Whoever had built the corridor had done so with remarkable care. Unlike the neglected rooms above, this hidden space showed little sign of water damage. The floor consisted of worn stone tiles coated with a thin layer of dust that looked almost untouched. Daniel moved slowly, sweeping his flashlight ahead. After 20 feet, the corridor opened into a small chamber. The beam of light landed on several framed portraits hanging neatly along the walls. He stopped. Every painting depicted members of what appeared to be the same family across different generations. Men in formal coats, women wearing elegant Victorian dresses, children standing proudly beside their parents. Each frame carried a small brass nameplate. Though years of dust made the lettering difficult to read, Daniel gently wiped one clean. Jonathan Harper, 1894. Another read, Sarah Harper. Then he noticed something unsettling. Every portrait had been carefully preserved, except for one figure. In each painting, a single face had been deliberately scratched away with deep, violent cuts. The rest of the canvas remained untouched. Whoever had done it had not tried to destroy the paintings themselves. They had wanted only one person erased. Daniel moved from portrait to portrait. Sometimes the missing face belonged to a young man. In another painting, it appeared to be an older woman. Yet the scratches looked remarkably similar, as though they had all been made during the same act of anger. He photographed each portrait with his phone before continuing deeper into the chamber. Against one wall stood several empty wooden shelves built directly into the brickwork. Their design immediately reminded him of the dusty outlines in the entrance hall upstairs. It seemed likely these shelves had once held books before being emptied. On the opposite side rested a narrow writing desk covered by a canvas cloth. He carefully folded the cloth back, revealing dried ink bottles, a rusted letter opener, and an oil lamp. Everything appeared arranged rather than abandoned. Whoever had left had expected the room to remain undisturbed. Daniel searched the drawers. Most contained blank paper ruined by age, but the bottom drawer refused to open more than an inch. Something behind it blocked the movement. Rather than forcing it, he made a note to return with proper tools. He reluctantly climbed back upstairs before sunset. Exploring hidden passages alone in an unstable building after dark felt like unnecessary risk. The next morning, he visited the local hardware store for work lights, masks, and cleaning supplies. As he loaded lumber into his truck, he heard someone call his name. Emily stood beside a small blue sedan, waving. "I thought I might find you here. I'm discovering this house needs more supplies than I can keep up with." She smiled. Old houses always do. She offered to stop by later with a few archival storage boxes from the library in case he found old papers worth preserving. Daniel appreciated the suggestion, but avoided mentioning the hidden passage until he understood it better. That afternoon, Emily arrived with her 12-year-old son, Noah. The boy carried flattened cardboard boxes almost as large as himself and looked around the mansion with open fascination. "This place is amazing," he said before his mother could remind him to be polite. "It's mostly broken," Daniel replied. "Broken things can still be interesting," Noah answered with complete confidence. Daniel laughed. "Fair point." While Emily sorted the storage boxes inside the entrance hall, Noah wandered only where his mother allowed, studying carved woodwork and decorative trim with unusual attention. "These shelves are strange," he finally said, pointing toward the wall where the missing bookcases had once stood. "Why?" Daniel asked. Noah crouched beside one remaining built-in cabinet. "Because somebody carved tiny letters down here." Daniel knelt beside him. Hidden beneath years of dirt near the base molding were 3 initials so small he would never have noticed them. E.H. They had been carved carefully into the wood before layers of paint covered them. Emily leaned closer. "Someone's initials." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe." After Noah and Emily left, Daniel returned to the hidden chamber carrying better lighting equipment. He carefully examined the writing desk again. This time he noticed faint grooves beneath its surface. Pressing gently along one edge released a concealed compartment no larger than a shoebox. Inside rested a leather-bound journal wrapped in faded linen cloth. Unlike everything else in the room, the journal appeared intentionally protected. The leather remained remarkably well preserved. Daniel carried it upstairs before opening it, unwilling to disturb the careful arrangement below any further. Sitting beneath the afternoon light pouring through the front window, he unfolded the cloth and opened the first page. Elegant handwriting filled the paper. The Journal of Eleanor Harper. Daniel quietly repeated the name. He turned several pages. Eleanor wrote about daily life in the mansion, the changing seasons, family dinners, and conversations with neighbors. Her words painted a picture of warmth rather than wealth. Children laughed in the gardens. Books filled every room. Visitors arrived regularly to borrow volumes from an ever-growing collection. Daniel found himself reading more slowly, almost hearing her voice through the faded ink. Then the tone changed. Later entries became cautious. Eleanor mentioned disagreements within the family, trusted friends who no longer seemed trustworthy, important documents that needed protection. Near the end of the notebook, several pages had been torn away. Only one intact paragraph remained on the final written page. Daniel read it twice before fully absorbing the meaning. "If these pages are ever found," Eleanor had written, "remember this above all else. The library must never fall into Whitmore hands." He stared at the sentence in silence, the journal still open across his knees, wondering why a warning written generations earlier still felt as though it had been waiting specifically for him. Daniel closed the journal carefully and stared through the dusty front window as the late afternoon light faded across the overgrown lawn. Eleanor Harper's final warning echoed in his thoughts. The library must never fall into Whitmore hands. She had written the words with steady confidence, not fear, as though she believed someone in the future would eventually read them. But who was Whitmore, and what library was she trying so desperately to protect? The hidden passage contained only empty shelves and family portraits. If there had once been a library, it was gone. He resisted the temptation to search the passage again that evening. The house still demanded practical attention before winter arrived. Rainwater leaked through part of the roof, and several broken windows needed temporary coverings. Mystery could wait a day. A collapsing roof could not. The next morning, Daniel replaced damaged boards over 2 rear windows before driving into town to purchase roofing tar and fasteners. As he loaded supplies into his truck, his phone rang. Margaret Ellis. "Would you have time to stop by the historical archives?" she asked. "I found something that doesn't make much sense." Less than 30 minutes later, Daniel entered the small history room attached to the town library. Shelves filled with binders, newspapers, and old property maps lined the walls. Margaret sat behind a large wooden table covered with yellowed documents. Emily looked up from a stack of newspapers and smiled. "Good timing," she said. "Margaret's been making interesting discoveries all morning." Margaret adjusted her glasses and pushed several photocopies toward Daniel. "These are county property records dating back more than a century." Daniel studied the pages. The mansion appeared repeatedly under the Harper family name through the early decades after it was built. Then the records simply stopped. "Where are the next years?" he asked. Margaret tapped another folder. "That's the problem. They're missing." Missing? Not damaged, not destroyed by age. Entire volumes covering nearly 20 years simply disappear from the courthouse records. Emily unfolded an old town map beside the property documents. "The mansion still appears here, but ownership changes aren't recorded during that period." Daniel frowned. "Can records just vanish?" Margaret sighed. "Old records are sometimes lost through fires or floods, but if that had happened, there would be gaps everywhere." She pointed across several pages. "Instead, only the Harper documents disappear." Silence settled over the table. Daniel remembered the scratched faces in the hidden portraits and Eleanor's warning. One mystery seemed quietly touching another. Margaret opened another folder. "I did find newspaper articles from before the missing years." Carefully unfolding one fragile page, she smiled faintly. "The Harper family appears more often than I expected." Daniel leaned closer. Headlines described donations toward building a school, funding repairs to a church, and supplying materials for a small community hospital. Another article praised the Harpers for helping establish a reading room that later became the town's first public library. None of it matched the family story Daniel had grown up hearing. His father had worked as an electrician. His grandfather had repaired farm equipment. No one had ever mentioned ancestors who funded public buildings or supported the town's early institutions. "Why doesn't anyone remember this?" Daniel asked quietly. Margaret folded her hands. "History isn't always erased dramatically. Sometimes it simply fades when no one keeps telling it." Emily looked thoughtfully at the newspaper, especially if the people who benefited become the ones writing the next chapter. Daniel slipped Eleanor's journal from his backpack. "There's something you should both see." He carefully opened to the final page and let them read the warning themselves. Emily looked up first. "Whitmore." Margaret remained unusually quiet. "Do you recognize the name?" Daniel asked. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "Samuel Whitmore is president of the Historical Society." "Do you think it's the same family?" Margaret hesitated before answering. "The Whitmores have lived here for generations. Whether they're connected to Eleanor's note, I honestly don't know." Before anyone could continue, the reading room door opened. A tall man in his late 60s entered carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. His gray suit looked immaculate, despite the dusty archives. Margaret offered a polite smile. "Samuel?" "Margaret." His voice carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. His eyes shifted toward Daniel. "You must be the gentleman who purchased Harper House." Daniel stood and offered his hand. "Daniel Harper." Samuel shook it warmly. "Welcome to our town." His gaze drifted briefly toward the old newspapers spread across the table. "Researching local history?" trying to understand the house, Daniel replied. Samuel smiled pleasantly. Old buildings inspire all sorts of stories, Margaret answered before Daniel could speak. We're reviewing documented history, not stories. Samuel's expression barely changed. Of course. He rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair. Harper House has attracted curiosity for decades. Most people eventually discover there's less mystery than they hoped. Daniel noticed Samuel's attention linger for just an instant on Eleanor's journal before returning to him. If you need historical information, Samuel continued, the Historical Society has an excellent collection, though I wouldn't spend too much energy chasing family legends. The words sounded friendly enough, yet something about them unsettled Daniel. Sometimes, legends begin with facts, Margaret replied quietly. Samuel gave a courteous nod. Sometimes, he wished everyone a pleasant afternoon and left as calmly as he had arrived. Emily waited until the door closed. That was interesting. Margaret looked toward the hallway. Samuel prefers tidy history. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Only that he dislikes speculation. Margaret gathered the newspapers into neat piles. Let's continue with evidence. They spent another hour examining maps and photographs. Among them, Daniel noticed an architectural drawing of the mansion's original first floor. He compared it with the current layout he had measured the previous day. Something immediately stood out. A section of wall near the rear of the house appeared much thicker in reality than on the original plans. He borrowed the copy and returned home before sunset. Inside the mansion, he measured again. Exterior dimensions, interior walls, hallway width. The numbers confirmed his suspicion. Nearly 4 feet of space remained unaccounted for behind the rear corridor. Carrying the flashlight into the hidden passage, he examined the brickwork inch by inch. At first, everything looked solid. Then he noticed faint scratches along one section of mortar. Unlike the surrounding bricks, these formed a nearly perfect rectangle extending from floor to ceiling. He pressed gently against the surface. Nothing moved. Kneeling lower, he swept away decades of dust gathered at the base of the wall. A thin metal edge appeared beneath the mortar line. Someone had concealed a door so carefully that only precise measurements could reveal it. Daniel stepped back, his pulse quickening. Behind the false brick wall, according to both the original plans and the hidden outline before him, another sealed room was waiting. Daniel studied the outline of the concealed doorway for several long moments before touching it again. The thin strip of exposed metal confirmed what the measurements had already suggested. Someone had built another room beyond the visible walls and had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase every sign of its existence. He ran his fingers carefully along the edge until they found a small recessed catch hidden near the floor. It refused to move. Rather than forcing it, he climbed back upstairs for proper tools, reminding himself that old mechanisms could be damaged by impatience. He returned with a flashlight, a soft brush, a pry tool, and a small bottle of penetrating oil. Years of restoring buildings had taught him that the strongest doors often yielded to patience instead of strength. He cleaned the narrow opening, removed packed dust from around the hidden latch, and waited while the oil seeped into the old metal. On his second attempt, the catch shifted with a faint click. Daniel pulled gently. The brick-faced panel moved only an inch before stopping. He pushed instead. Slowly, almost silently, the concealed door swung inward on heavy iron hinges. Cool, dry air drifted into the passage. Daniel raised his flashlight and stepped across the threshold. The beam disappeared into a room far larger than he had imagined. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling along every wall. More stood in orderly rows across the center of the room, creating narrow aisles that disappeared into the darkness. Thousands of books filled the shelves. Leather bindings in shades of brown, green, and deep red stood shoulder to shoulder, many still carrying small handwritten labels. Unlike the neglected rooms above, everything here had been protected. The air remained dry. Thick curtains covered small ventilation openings near the ceiling, allowing just enough circulation to preserve the room without exposing it to sunlight. Dust covered the floor, but very little rested on the books themselves. Daniel stood in complete silence. He had expected another storage room. Instead, he had found an entire private library sealed away from the world. He walked slowly down the nearest aisle, afraid that even his footsteps might disturb the careful order surrounding him. The shelves contained history, architecture, literature, engineering, agriculture, poetry, and hundreds of volumes whose titles had faded with age. Many carried embossed bookplates reading simply, Harper Family Library. Others included handwritten notes tucked between the pages, as though several generations had shared the same books. Along one wall stood a large oak table surrounded by reading chairs. An old globe rested beside neatly arranged magnifying lenses and brass bookends shaped like oak leaves. Someone had left the room expecting it to be used again someday. Daniel rested his hand lightly on one chair. For the first time since losing everything, he felt as though he had entered a place where time had paused instead of ended. He took dozens of photographs before touching anything else. Then he climbed upstairs, locked the hidden passage behind him, and drove directly to town. Emily looked up from her desk as he entered the library carrying his camera. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel smiled faintly. "Not a ghost," he hesitated. "I need your help." Less than an hour later, she stood beside him inside the hidden room. She said nothing for nearly a full minute. Her eyes slowly moved across the endless shelves. Finally, she whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." Daniel nodded. "Neither have I." Emily approached one shelf with obvious care. "These aren't random collections." She examined several bindings without removing them. Whoever organized this knew exactly what they were doing. Together they began a slow visual survey without disturbing the arrangement. Many books contained small handwritten catalog numbers. Others carried family signatures dating back generations. Entire sections focused on architecture and building design. Another held local histories from neighboring counties. One shelf contained family Bibles with births, marriages, and deaths carefully recorded inside. Daniel opened one volume only far enough to confirm the entries. Harper names filled page after page. "This wasn't just a library," Emily said quietly. "It was an archive." Near the rear wall, they discovered a long cabinet containing oversized drawers. Inside rested rolled architectural plans tied neatly with faded ribbon. Daniel carefully untied one bundle and spread the drawing across the oak table. It showed detailed plans for the town's original schoolhouse. Another revealed the first public hospital. A third contained construction drawings for the library where Emily now worked. In the lower corner of each sheet appeared the same signature, Harper and Sons Builders. Daniel stared at the handwriting. "My family built these." Emily looked up from another drawing. "Not just built them. These notes mention donated materials." She pointed towards several handwritten calculations. They charged only part of the actual cost. They continued searching. Carefully labeled boxes held correspondence tied with cotton string. Daniel selected one at random and unfolded the first letter. A minister thanked the Harper family for funding repairs after a devastating winter storm. Another letter expressed gratitude for providing books to children whose families could not afford them. A physician thanked the Harpers for helping purchase medical equipment for the small hospital. None of the letters praised wealth. They praised generosity. Daniel slowly lowered the final page. "No one ever told me any of this." Emily smiled gently. "Maybe no one knew." Near sunset, they reached a section containing personal journals arranged by year. The oldest volumes belonged to Jonathan Harper. Later shelves included Sarah, Thomas, Eleanor, and several other family members. The journals formed an almost unbroken record stretching across 4 generations. Daniel carefully removed only the first volume from each section to verify their condition before returning them exactly where they had been. "This could take months to read," Emily said. "Maybe years." Daniel nodded. "Then we start one page at a time." As they prepared to leave, Emily noticed something standing alone against the far wall beyond the final row of shelves. Unlike the surrounding bookcases, it was made entirely of black iron. A tall cabinet stood there, its heavy door secured by an old mechanical lock. Riveted across the front was a polished brass plaque that remained surprisingly untarnished despite the passing years. Daniel brushed away a thin layer of dust until every word became clear. Together they read the inscription in silence. "Open only when truth matters more than inheritance." Daniel and Emily stood quietly before the iron cabinet. Neither of them reached for the handle immediately. The inscription across the brass plaque carried a weight that had nothing to do with metal. "Open only when truth matters more than inheritance." Daniel looked at Emily. If Eleanor left this here, she wanted whoever found it to think before opening it. Emily nodded. "Then let's do exactly that." They examined the cabinet carefully before attempting the lock. Unlike the hidden doorway, this mechanism had never been concealed. It had simply been left, waiting. The keyhole was larger than the brass key Daniel had discovered inside the entrance hall wall. He searched nearby drawers until he noticed a shallow wooden tray tucked beneath the cabinet. Inside rested a second key, blackened with age but carefully wrapped in linen. A small handwritten label lay beside it. "For the one willing to know everything." Daniel inserted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly. The heavy bolts withdrew with a deep metallic sound, and the cabinet door opened without resistance. Instead of valuables, the shelves held bundles of carefully organized documents tied with faded cloth ribbons. Each bundle carried handwritten labels: original deeds, construction ledgers, contracts, family correspondence, legal records. Emily carefully lifted the first ledger onto the reading table. "These should stay flat," she said gently. "The bindings are still strong, but we shouldn't rush." Daniel opened the construction ledger first. Every page recorded projects completed by Harper & Sons builders: schools, churches, bridges, homes. Beside each project were columns listing materials, labor costs, and handwritten notes. One entry caught his attention: community hospital expansion, lumber donated, labor reduced by half. Several similar notes appeared throughout the book. The family had repeatedly accepted smaller profits to help complete public buildings. "Your ancestors weren't just builders," Emily said quietly. "They invested in this town." Daniel slowly turned another page. "And somehow, almost no one remembers." The next bundle contained property contracts. Most appeared routine until Emily paused over one page. "Daniel?" He looked up. She pointed toward two signatures at the bottom of a transfer agreement. These names don't match. Daniel leaned closer. One signature flowed naturally across the page. The other looked stiff, with uneven spacing and uncertain pen strokes. Emily compared it to several earlier documents signed by the same Harper family member. Look at the capital letters, she said. They're completely different. Daniel searched through additional contracts. More inconsistencies appeared. Some signatures matched perfectly. Others looked awkward, as though someone had copied them slowly instead of writing naturally. These could be forgeries, he said. Emily nodded without speaking. Neither wanted to reach conclusions too quickly, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. They carefully returned the contracts before opening another bundle labeled Private Journals Eleanor Harper. Unlike the smaller journal Daniel had already discovered, these volumes covered many years. Eleanor wrote with remarkable precision. She described family dinners, construction meetings, charitable donations, and conversations with neighbors. Gradually, the tone shifted. Entries became shorter. She mentioned disagreements over land ownership. Trusted business associates demanded larger shares of family projects. Legal disputes multiplied. Then one sentence stopped Daniel. Truth disappears quietly when respectable people agree not to speak. He looked at Emily. She knew exactly what was happening. Emily continued reading several pages ahead. Eleanor described collecting copies of contracts, receipts, letters, and deeds because she feared original records might someday disappear. She never wrote with bitterness. Instead, she documented everything carefully, almost like a historian preparing evidence for someone she would never meet. Daniel closed the journal gently. She wasn't writing for herself anymore. She was writing for the future, Emily replied. Over the next several days, they developed a routine. Mornings were devoted to repairing the mansion before winter. Afternoons were spent inside the hidden library, cataloging books and organizing fragile documents into archival boxes Emily borrowed from the public library. Daniel repaired damaged shelves while Emily created handwritten inventories. Noah occasionally stopped by after school with his mother, carrying labels or helping sort empty storage boxes. Although Daniel never allowed him to handle the oldest documents, the boy enjoyed reading book titles aloud and carefully dusting lower shelves with a soft brush. The quiet work gradually transformed the hidden room from a forgotten archive into a place where history could once again be understood. One afternoon, Emily looked up from her notes. "I've noticed something." "What?" Daniel asked. "Every time Eleanor describes an important event, she mentions where supporting documents are stored. She wanted anyone reading these journals to verify everything." Daniel smiled. A builder leaves blueprints. Eleanor left evidence. Their conversations became easier as the days passed. They shared coffee while sorting letters, compared favorite authors while shelving books, and occasionally laughed at humorous notes scribbled in the margins by generations of Harper children. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself looking forward to each morning instead of wondering how he would survive it. Late one afternoon, the sound of a vehicle stopping outside interrupted their work. Daniel climbed upstairs and found Samuel Whitmore standing on the front porch, hands folded neatly behind his back. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Samuel said politely. "Not at all." Samuel glanced toward the quiet entrance hall. "I've heard you're making interesting discoveries." Daniel answered carefully. "Mostly old family records." Samuel smiled. "Historical collections require considerable care." "We're doing our best." After a brief pause, Samuel continued. "If you happen to uncover documents connected to the town's early history, the Historical Society would be willing to purchase them. We have proper storage facilities and experienced archivists." Daniel thought about Eleanor's journals resting safely below his feet. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I'd like to understand what I've found before making any decisions." Samuel's smile remained unchanged. "A reasonable position." He reached into his coat pocket and handed Daniel a business card. "If you change your mind, my offer will remain open." After he left, Daniel returned to the hidden library. Emily listened quietly as he described the conversation. "Do you think he knows what's down here?" she asked. "I don't know." Daniel looked toward the rows of journals, but Eleanor warned that the library should never fall into Whitmore hands. Neither spoke for a moment. Instead, they resumed cataloging another shelf of dictionaries and reference books. As Daniel lifted one unusually thick dictionary from its place, something slipped from between the pages and landed softly on the table. It was a folded sheet of paper, hidden so carefully that it might have remained undiscovered for another generation. He unfolded it slowly. There was no signature at the bottom, only a handwritten confession beginning with a single sentence. "I have remained silent for too many years." The unsigned confession trembled slightly in Daniel's hands as he unfolded the remaining pages. The handwriting differed from Eleanor Harper's careful script. The writer sounded older, burdened by years of regret. Emily pulled another chair beside him, and together they began reading. "I have remained silent for too many years," the letter began. "Silence has protected my family while destroying another. If these words are ever found, let them stand where my voice never did." Daniel continued reading aloud. The writer described attending private meetings where legal documents concerning the Harper family had been altered before being filed. He never claimed to have forged the signatures himself, but he admitted witnessing the deception and choosing not to object. "I believed prosperity justified compromise," the confession read. "Instead, compromise became theft." Several paragraphs later, one sentence brought both readers to a halt. "My father insisted that Whitmore interests must come before Harper claims, and I obeyed when I should have refused." Daniel slowly lowered the paper. "Whitmore." Emily nodded silently. The confession never identified its author by name, yet the connection was unmistakable. The writer spoke of his own father guiding the decisions that benefited the Whitmore family, while the Harpers steadily lost property, contracts, and influence. "This isn't proof by itself," Emily said carefully. "No signature." "No," Daniel agreed, "but it fits everything else we found." They placed the confession inside an archival sleeve before returning to Eleanor's journals. Several entries described court hearings that ended unexpectedly, despite what she believed were legitimate claims. Others mentioned trusted neighbors becoming strangely distant once ownership disputes began. No single page accused anyone directly. Instead, the journals patiently documented dates, meetings, receipts, and conversations, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Daniel admired Eleanor's discipline. She had resisted anger even while watching her family's reputation disappear. The following afternoon, Margaret joined them inside the hidden library for the first time. She paused in complete amazement as she looked across the endless shelves. "Good heavens," she whispered. "No wonder she protected it." Daniel carefully handed her the unsigned confession. Margaret read every page without interruption. When she finished, she remained quiet for a long moment. "Whoever wrote this carried enormous guilt," she finally said. "Do you think it's genuine?" Daniel asked. Margaret considered the question. "The handwriting appears consistent throughout. The paper matches the period, but without a signature, it remains supporting evidence, not final proof. She returned the document to its protective sleeve. Even so, it explains why Eleanor preserved so many records. Emily nodded. She expected future readers to compare everything. Margaret smiled sadly. She trusted evidence more than memory. 2 days later, Samuel Whitmore requested a meeting. Daniel agreed to meet him at the Historical Society building rather than invite him into the mansion. Samuel welcomed him politely into a quiet office lined with framed photographs of the town's founders. After offering coffee, he spoke without urgency. "I've been thinking about our last conversation." Daniel waited. Samuel folded his hands on the desk. "The Harper family once contributed greatly to this community. No one disputes that." Daniel noticed the careful wording. "Then why did people stop talking about them?" Samuel sighed. "History is rarely as simple as we'd like." He stood and walked toward an old photograph hanging on the wall. "Families make mistakes. Businesses fail. Records disappear." Daniel thought of forged signatures, missing courthouse volumes, and Eleanor's journals. Records don't usually disappear by themselves. Samuel looked back at him. Perhaps not. The room remained silent for several seconds. Finally, Samuel spoke more quietly. "I should tell you something. My grandfather often hinted that our family had benefited from decisions made long before I was born. He never explained exactly what he meant." Daniel watched him carefully. Samuel's expression showed neither defensiveness nor denial, only weariness. "Did he ever mention the Harpers?" Daniel asked. Samuel nodded once. "Only once. He said there were truths respectable people preferred not to revisit." "Did you believe him?" "I didn't know what to believe." Samuel returned to his chair. "If you've discovered documents that answer those questions, I hope you'll handle them responsibly." Daniel stood. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do." Samuel did not attempt to stop him. "Then I wish you wisdom." As Daniel drove back toward the mansion, he realized Samuel had admitted suspicion without admitting knowledge. It was not the confession Daniel had expected, but it made Eleanor's warning feel even more complicated. The past had trapped more than one family. News of the restoration spread quietly through town. A local carpenter arrived one morning carrying reclaimed oak flooring. "Heard you're fixing the old place," he said. "I've got leftover lumber you can have." The following day, an electrician volunteered to inspect the wiring once power could safely be restored. A retired mason stopped by with advice on repairing the chimney. None of them asked to see the hidden library. They simply wanted to help save the mansion. Emily smiled as another volunteer unloaded boxes of cleaning supplies. "People are starting to care." Daniel looked around the front hall, where broken furniture had been replaced with stacks of organized materials and carefully labeled boxes. Maybe they always did. They just needed a reason. Together, the volunteers repaired porch steps, stabilized damaged shelving, and cleared years of overgrown brush from the front garden. Noah spent one Saturday afternoon polishing brass hardware and happily announcing every interesting book title he discovered while helping Emily inventory the library. Watching neighbors work side by side inside the old house, Daniel felt something shifting. When he had purchased the mansion, he believed he was buying a ruined building. Now he understood he had inherited a responsibility that reached far beyond property ownership. The library was no longer simply his family's secret. It preserved part of the town's forgotten memory. That evening, after the volunteers had gone home, Margaret arrived carrying a worn archival box she had retrieved from the courthouse basement. She placed it carefully on the reading table inside the hidden library. "I almost missed it," she admitted. "It had been filed in the wrong storage section decades ago." Daniel gently lifted the lid. Inside rested a massive handwritten ledger bound in cracked brown leather. Margaret looked at him with quiet excitement. "I believe," she said, "I finally found the missing courthouse ledger." Margaret placed the courthouse ledger gently on the oak reading table, and for a moment, no one spoke. The cracked leather cover carried no title, only a faded county seal pressed into its surface. Daniel carefully untied the brittle cloth ribbon that held it closed, while Emily adjusted the reading lamp so the light fell evenly across the pages. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained remarkably clear. Margaret smiled faintly. County clerks were meticulous. They expected these records to outlive them. Daniel turned the first pages slowly. Property transfers, tax assessments, boundary surveys. Every transaction had been recorded in careful handwriting. The entries progressed year by year until they reached the very period missing from the courthouse archives. Emily leaned closer. "This is it." Several pages later, the Harper name appeared repeatedly beside construction contracts, donated land, and community projects. Then the handwriting changed. New entries recorded ownership transfers involving several Harper properties. Daniel immediately compared the signatures to the contracts from the iron cabinet. They did not match. The ledger preserved earlier authentic signatures beside later documents whose handwriting clearly differed. Margaret examined them through a magnifying glass. "These are not natural variations," she said quietly. "The genuine signatures flow. These later ones hesitate." Daniel spread several documents side by side. Original deeds from the library, contracts from the cabinet, the courthouse ledger. Together they told a story no single document could explain alone. Emily traced one property description with her finger. "Look at the dates." Daniel followed her hand. A parcel donated by the Harper family for public use had somehow been transferred into private ownership only months later, before eventually changing hands again. Similar patterns appeared throughout the ledger. Properties intended for schools, community buildings, and charitable projects slowly disappeared through transactions that no longer looked legitimate. Margaret closed her notebook. "This doesn't simply suggest forgery." She looked at Daniel. "It establishes a pattern." They spent the next several days organizing the evidence carefully, rather than rushing toward conclusions. Every document received a number. Every ledger page was photographed. Emily created detailed cross-reference lists, connecting journals, contracts, deeds, and newspaper articles. Daniel built protective shelving inside one restored room upstairs, where duplicate working copies could be safely examined without disturbing the original archive below. The physical work helped balance the emotional weight of what they were uncovering. The mansion itself slowly began changing. Freshly repaired windows allowed sunlight to reach rooms that had remained dark for years. Volunteers painted porch railings. Garden beds were cleared of weeds. Daniel repaired the large reading room where the outlines of missing bookshelves had first caught his attention. Although the original shelves had long ago been removed, new oak bookcases now stood in their place, built in the same style as the originals. Emily watched him fit the final shelf into place. "You're giving the house its purpose back," she said. Daniel smiled. "Feels like it's giving mine back, too." Word of the restoration spread beyond the town. A regional newspaper contacted Margaret after hearing rumors about newly discovered historical records connected to the community's founding. Rather than making dramatic claims, Margaret simply confirmed that significant archival material had been located and was being carefully authenticated. Within days, additional historians requested permission to review selected documents. Daniel insisted every visitor follow Emily's preservation guidelines. The story attracted attention not because of hidden treasure, but because forgotten history had survived almost untouched. One afternoon, Emily arrived carrying rolled display boards. "The library has agreed to help." Daniel looked up from repairing a window frame. "Help with what?" "An exhibition," she smiled. "Not everything, just copies of the photographs, maps, and construction plans, enough for people to understand what the Harper family contributed." Daniel considered the idea before nodding. If Eleanor wanted the truth preserved, hiding it forever wouldn't honor that. Together they began selecting items that could safely be reproduced. Architectural drawings of the schoolhouse, letters thanking the family for supporting the hospital, early photographs showing Harper builders standing beside newly completed public buildings. Rather than presenting accusations, the exhibition focused first on documented contributions. Emily believed facts would speak more clearly than outrage. Noah eagerly volunteered to help arrange labels after school. While sorting empty archival folders near one of the rear bookcases, he paused. "Mr. Harper." Daniel looked over. "What is it?" Noah pointed toward a narrow gap behind the lowest shelf. "There's something back here." Daniel knelt beside him and carefully slid the bookcase forward a few inches. Wedged between the wall and the wood rested a flat wooden case wrapped in faded blue cloth. Dust suggested it had remained hidden for decades. Emily gently lifted it onto the table. The lid carried a single handwritten name: Eleanor Harper. Inside lay a sealed envelope tied with white ribbon. The paper had yellowed, but the wax seal remained unbroken. Beneath it rested a short handwritten note. "To the Harper who finally restores this house." Daniel stared at the envelope without touching it. Emily read the note again before looking at him. She expected someone to come back. Margaret, who had arrived moments earlier carrying additional archive sleeves, quietly examined the seal. "This should remain unopened until the proper moment." Daniel nodded. "Agreed." Margaret unfolded another sheet tucked beneath the envelope. It appeared to be written in Eleanor's familiar hand. Unlike the sealed letter, this page was intended to be read immediately. Daniel carefully read the instructions aloud. "When the truth has been gathered, when the records can stand on their own, reveal everything together during the town's Founders' Day celebration. Let evidence speak before emotion. Let history belong to everyone." Silence settled over the room. Emily looked toward the restored shelves surrounding them. "Founders' Day is only a few weeks away." Daniel gently placed the sealed letter back inside its wooden case. Eleanor had planned every step with remarkable patience, trusting that someday someone would finish the work she could not. He closed the lid carefully, knowing the final piece of her story was waiting, but only until the day she had chosen, more than a century earlier. Founders' Day arrived beneath a clear autumn sky that drew nearly the entire town into the square. Booths lined the sidewalks, children carried paper flags, and local musicians filled the morning air with familiar songs. For generations, the celebration had honored the community's founders. Yet this year, a quiet sense of anticipation lingered among the crowd. News of the restored Victorian mansion and the remarkable collection of historical records had spread far beyond casual rumor. Daniel arrived early with Emily, Margaret, and several volunteers who carefully carried archival display cases into the community hall beside the square. Every original document remained protected inside archival sleeves, while enlarged photographs and certified copies filled the exhibition panels. Margaret insisted that every statement be supported by evidence. No dramatic accusations appeared anywhere. Instead, visitors would see dates, signatures, maps, construction plans, letters, and journals exactly as they had survived. Daniel paused before the first display. A large photograph showed the mansion as it had once stood, surrounded by gardens instead of weeds. Beside it rested architectural drawings signed Harper and Sons Builders. Across the room, Emily arranged copies of letters thanking the Harper family for donating materials to the school, the hospital, and the original public library. Noah carefully checked every display label one final time. "Everything's ready," he said proudly. Daniel smiled. "You've earned that job." By mid-morning, the hall filled steadily. Visitors moved slowly from one exhibit to another, reading far longer than Daniel expected. Many stopped before the construction ledgers, surprised to learn how often the Harper family had reduced their own profits so public buildings could be completed. Others quietly studied photographs showing familiar landmarks under construction more than a century earlier. Margaret answered questions patiently, always directing people back to the documents themselves. "Don't take my word for it," she repeated several times. "Read the records." Daniel noticed elderly residents lingering before the family photographs. One woman quietly remarked that her grandfather had once spoken about generous builders whose names had somehow disappeared from local conversation. Another visitor recognized the old hospital plans from stories passed through his family. Piece by piece, forgotten memories began connecting with written evidence. Shortly before noon, the mayor invited Daniel to speak, standing before neighbors he had known only a few weeks. Daniel felt unexpectedly nervous. He looked across the audience before beginning. "When I bought the old Harper house, I thought I was purchasing a broken building." A few smiles appeared. "Instead, I found generations of people who believed books, records, and truth should survive longer than they did." He gestured toward the exhibition. "Everything displayed here comes directly from journals, deeds, construction records, newspaper archives, and courthouse documents. None of it asks for sympathy. It simply asks to be remembered." Daniel stepped aside as Margaret addressed the audience. With the calm precision of a lifelong historian, she explained how the recovered courthouse ledger matched original Harper deeds, construction ledgers, and preserved journals. She demonstrated differences between authentic signatures and later forged documents without exaggeration. Every conclusion rested upon multiple records rather than assumption. The room remained silent as visitors realized the evidence formed one consistent history. Emily then described the library hidden within the mansion and the extraordinary care Eleanor Harper had taken to preserve both books and documents for future generations. Rather than emphasizing secrecy, she spoke about responsibility. "The greatest gift preserved there wasn't property," she said. "It was memory." Near the back of the hall, Daniel noticed Samuel Whitmore quietly enter. He stood unnoticed for several minutes, studying the displays before slowly approaching the front. When the presentations concluded, he requested permission to speak. The room fell silent. Samuel removed his glasses and looked first toward Margaret, then toward Daniel. "For many years," he began, "my family possessed stories that were never fully explained." He paused. "My grandfather often suggested that our prosperity came with obligations we had failed to meet." He turned toward the exhibition behind him. "After reviewing these records, I no longer believe silence honors anyone." Daniel watched him carefully. Samuel's voice remained steady. "The evidence presented here deserves recognition, whether through action or inaction. Members of my family benefited, while the Harper family's contributions gradually disappeared from public memory. I cannot change decisions made generations before my birth." He looked toward Daniel. "But I can acknowledge that this history belongs to the town. and it deserves to be restored honestly. No applause followed immediately. Instead, a thoughtful quiet settled across the hall as people absorbed the significance of his words. Finally, the mayor stepped forward. The council has reviewed these records during the past week with assistance from independent historians. He unfolded a prepared statement. Based upon the evidence presented, the town formally recognizes the Harper family's foundational contributions to our schools, hospital, public library, and early civic development. Several council members nodded in agreement. We will begin correcting official historical records accordingly. This time, applause spread naturally through the room. It was not loud or celebratory so much as deeply respectful. Daniel looked toward Margaret, whose eyes glistened with quiet satisfaction. Emily squeezed his hand briefly before returning her attention to the visitors gathering around the exhibits. Throughout the afternoon, residents shared family stories, donated old photographs for comparison, and offered assistance with preserving the newly recovered archive. The exhibition became less about one family than about the community rediscovering part of itself. As the crowd gradually dispersed near sunset, Daniel carried the small wooden case containing Eleanor Harper's sealed envelope back to the restored reading room inside the mansion. Emily, Margaret, and Noah joined him around the oak table where the case rested. No one spoke while Daniel untied the faded ribbon securing it. The unbroken wax seal caught the evening light. Eleanor had instructed that the final letter remain unopened until the truth had been shared with the town. That moment had finally arrived. Daniel rested his hand gently upon the envelope, took a slow breath, and carefully broke the century-old seal. Daniel lifted the letter from its envelope with both hands. The paper was thin but remarkably well preserved, its careful folds protecting ink that had waited more than a century to be read. Emily, Margaret, and Noah remained silent around the oak table as Daniel unfolded the pages. Eleanor Harper's handwriting appeared immediately, steady and unmistakable. To the Harper who finally returns, the letter began. Daniel paused for only a moment before continuing aloud. If you are reading these words, then you have already discovered something more valuable than this house. You have discovered the truth. The room seemed to grow even quieter. Many will wonder why I hid these books instead of fighting harder in my own lifetime. The answer is simple. Lies often travel faster than truth, but truth is patient. It waits without anger until someone is willing to carry it honestly. Daniel looked briefly toward the shelves surrounding them before returning to the letter. Eleanor wrote that she had watched friends become strangers, trusted partners become opponents, and public gratitude disappear beneath years of carefully maintained silence. She admitted feeling grief, but never hatred. Our family lost property, she wrote, but property was never our greatest work. Buildings can be taken, land can be transferred, names may even fade. Character cannot be stolen unless we surrender it ourselves. Emily quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. Daniel continued reading. Eleanor explained that every journal, deed, receipt, architectural drawing, and letter had been preserved not to reclaim wealth, but to protect memory. She believed another generation would eventually value truth more than ownership. If you have reached this page, she wrote, then you have already chosen correctly. Had you sought inheritance alone, you would never have understood this library. Daniel smiled faintly. He had purchased the mansion believing it might become a financial rescue. Instead, it had become something far greater. Near the end of the letter, Eleanor addressed the future directly. Do not seek revenge against those who came after us. They did not create every injustice they inherited. Give them the opportunity to choose honesty over comfort. That choice is where healing begins. Daniel slowly lowered the pages. Samuel Whitmore's words at the exhibition suddenly carried new meaning. Eleanor had anticipated that even descendants of those who benefited from the past deserved the chance to acknowledge it rather than remain imprisoned by it. The final paragraph stood alone at the bottom of the page. If this house ever lives again, let it belong to readers instead of owners. Fill these rooms with people who love learning more than possessions. Then our family will never truly disappear. Beneath her signature, she had written one final sentence in larger letters. Buildings may crumble. Books, remember. No one spoke for several moments. Margaret finally broke the silence. She understood history better than most historians. Emily carefully folded the letter back into its protective sleeve. She also understood forgiveness. Daniel looked around the hidden library. What had begun as an abandoned mansion now felt like the heart of something still alive. During the weeks that followed, restoration accelerated with renewed purpose. Volunteers returned almost every weekend. Local carpenters repaired damaged flooring. Electricians restored safe wiring without disturbing the historic structure. Garden clubs replanted the neglected grounds using flowers identified from old Harper family photographs. Students from nearby schools helped clean books under Emily's supervision, learning proper preservation techniques as they worked. The hidden library remained protected, but selected rooms upstairs gradually opened for guided tours explaining the mansion's history. Every visitor began in the restored reading room, where copies of the journals and documents told the Harper family story through evidence rather than legend. The town council formally approved a new name for the property, the Harper Family Library and Heritage Center. Rather than becoming a private residence again, the mansion would serve as a place where local history, family archives, and community education could continue together. Daniel accepted the decision without hesitation. Eleanor had never intended the house to belong to one person. She had intended it to belong to the truth. Emily accepted the position of the center's first director. Her experience as a librarian made her the natural choice, and she approached the responsibility with quiet dedication. She organized volunteers, developed preservation procedures, and partnered with schools so children could study original local history instead of reading only brief summaries in textbooks. Margaret donated decades of her own research notes, photographs, and newspaper collections to the growing archive. "These belong here now," she said simply. "History is strongest when it stays together." Even Samuel Whitmore contributed. Several weeks after Founders Day, he delivered family correspondence that had remained in his attic for generations. Some letters confirmed details already known. Others added missing pieces to the town's early history. He made no speeches and sought no recognition. He simply placed the carefully wrapped documents on the table before Daniel. It's time these were where they should have been all along. Daniel thanked him with a quiet handshake. No further words were necessary. One crisp autumn afternoon, as sunlight filled the restored reading room, Noah arrived carrying a newly published history book about the county. "The school ordered extra copies," he announced proudly. Emily smiled. "Would you like to do the honors?" Noah nodded eagerly. Together they walked into the hidden library, where a single empty space had intentionally been left on one shelf. Daniel had preserved it from the beginning, believing the collection should continue growing, rather than remain frozen in the past. Noah carefully slid the new book into its place between two older volumes. It fit perfectly. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Now the story keeps going." Daniel looked at the endless shelves stretching through the quiet room. For generations, the library had protected the past. Now it had begun protecting the future as well. Before leaving that evening, Daniel carried one final item to the front entrance of the mansion. Above the restored doorway, craftsmen had prepared a simple wooden beam. With steady hands, he fastened a carved plaque into place. Visitors entering the building would see the words before anything else. Buildings may crumble. Books, remember. He stepped back onto the front walk as families wandered through the gardens. Children carried borrowed books toward the porch, and warm light glowed from windows that had once been dark and forgotten. Months earlier, he had stood outside the courthouse, believing bankruptcy had erased every meaningful part of his life. Losing everything had seemed like the end of his story. Instead, it had quietly become the beginning of another family's unfinished chapter. And, unexpectedly, the beginning of his own. The mansion no longer stood abandoned behind broken gates. It stood open, filled with readers, neighbors, laughter, and shelves that would never again be hidden from the people they were meant to serve. Eleanor Harper had been right. Buildings could crumble with time. Wealth could vanish. Names could be forgotten. But truth, carefully written and faithfully preserved, could wait across generations until someone finally opened the door and chose to remember. As the years passed, people stopped calling it the forgotten Victorian mansion. It simply became the Harper Family Library. Children came after school to read beneath the same towering ceilings where generations of Harpers had once gathered around books. Local families donated old photographs, journals, and letters that might otherwise have been lost forever. Historians traveled from neighboring counties to study the remarkable collection, not because it contained hidden treasure, but because it preserved something far more valuable: the truth. Daniel often smiled when visitors congratulated him on finding such an incredible inheritance. "You inherited a fortune," they would say. He always answered the same way. "No, I inherited a responsibility." The $30,000 he had once believed was the biggest gamble of his life turned out to be the smallest part of the story. The real investment wasn't the house. It was choosing not to walk away from something everyone else had given up on. Emily transformed the library into a place where every generation felt welcome. Margaret lived long enough to see the town's history rewritten with honesty, knowing the names that had once been erased would never disappear again. Even Samuel Whitmore found peace by helping preserve the truth instead of protecting old silence, proving that reconciliation begins the moment people choose integrity over pride. Years later, when Noah was old enough to volunteer as a guide, he loved showing visitors the hidden passage behind the staircase. Every tour ended the same way. He would stop beneath the carved wooden plaque and read its simple message aloud. "Buildings may crumble. Books, remember." Most visitors thought it was only about books. It wasn't. It was about people. Homes can be lost. Businesses can fail. Money can disappear almost overnight. Even a family's good name can be buried beneath years of misunderstanding. But kindness never truly disappears. Honesty leaves a trail. Generosity echoes through generations. And the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, has a remarkable way of finding someone willing to uncover it. Daniel Harper had walked into that mansion believing he was the biggest failure in his family's history. He walked out knowing he had become the person who restored it, not by seeking revenge, not by chasing wealth, but by choosing truth over comfort, forgiveness over bitterness, and service over ownership. Perhaps that's the greatest inheritance any of us can receive, because the most valuable legacy we leave behind isn't measured by the houses we own, the money we earn, or the titles beside our names. It is measured by the lives we quietly improve, the memories we protect, and the courage we have to do what is right even when no one is watching.
If this story leaves you with one thought today, let it be this.
Never judge the value of something by its appearance alone. Sometimes the most broken house shelters the greatest story. Sometimes the greatest treasure isn't hidden beneath the floorboards. It's hidden inside the character of the people who came before us, and inside the choice we make to carry their goodness forward. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, I'd love to hear what part stayed with you the most. Share it in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and never underestimate the quiet power of truth, kindness, and a good book. Because, as Eleanor Harper reminded us, buildings may crumble, books remember.